Up with right around the beginning of the Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew. So it's just a quick and dirty way to find the Psalms and find the beginning of the New Testament. But the point I want to make through this is that you notice how much history is in our Hebrew Scriptures versus here. And in fact, the Hebrew Scriptures encapsulate about roughly, 1,300 years of history, roughly, and but the New Testament is just a little bit over 50 years. So there is more writing per year in the New Testament, but the majority of our Bible is made up of the Hebrew Scriptures, and of course, this was Jesus' own Bible, was the Hebrew Scriptures, not the New Testament. And sometimes it's helpful for us as Christians to remember that. This is his Bible and his history, the history that he would have been taught as a child and been very familiar with, at least parts of it. And we are going to, I announced that this would be a 5-session class, but next week we have our congregational meeting. So I'm going to try to squeeze that extra session in just kind of throughout the 4 classes, so we don't have to add another class to the schedule. We'll see if we can do it. So today we're actually going to go from the beginnings of Israelite history through the emergence into the land of Canaan by the Israelites as a people. So that's quite a daunting task because there's a lot. I spent one semester just in grad school just like plowing every minute I could just to studying the emergence part of Israel. and I mean, it's so complicated. And so just to imagine, now that's just one part what we're going to cover is a little intimidating. But if you look at your Bibles, the first 11 chapters of, you don't have to pick them up, but the first 11 chapters of our Bible in the book of Genesis is what they consider to be the primordial history. It's kind of pretty overt mythology. They may not be trying to describe exactly what happened, in historical detail, 6,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago or whatever. They're trying to describe what always happens over and over again up until the present day. So you get stories like Adam and Eve and the flood, Cain and Abel, and things like this. And then there's an abrupt change in the literature, starting with chapter 12, and that's where you get something that is at least more overtly historical. Now, by historical, I do not mean that everything you read has happened that way as well from that chapter forward, but you get something that's more about an historical narrative, and there might be what I call the mythological imagination, weaved into that, and we'll kind of get into that. So basically, while we're going to cover history, I find it's helpful to me. It's been helpful in my path to, even though I know that there are things that happened for sure, like it said, I actually like to approach the Bible as if it's pure fiction. Not because it is, but because it forces me to think, well, why did the author put this story in there rather than another story? Or why did the author highlight particular aspects of this story? Because even when you write straight history, that's what you do. I mean, we know that if you write the history of the United States, you could write that in a whole lot of different ways. And so if you just kind of think about, well, why did this author choose this account over another one? So where you kind of get the point, get more closer to like, what's the point of view that's being offered. For Israel, the foundational, the narrative is, that starts their particular history is the call of Abraham and Sarah. This would have happened somewhere around in the late Bronze Age. That's kind of where things kind of settle out into about the 18th century BCE. And Abraham hears a call from God, and the Bible does not describe how he hears this call, but it is to leave his homeland in a place called Ur of the Chaldees, which is, if you look at the map, this is the late Bronze Age Israel, and where that yellow line starts on the right, Ur in Mesopotamia, that's where he starts out. So what we have here is the Mesopotamians. You also have, if you go up, you see the city of Asher. That's where the Assyrians were. And then if you go further over the left to the top, that's where the Hittites were located. You go down, directly down, and you see the Egyptians. And there's a reason, this kind of traces his path. He first goes up to Haran, and then down into Canaan. This is where God apparently instructs him to go. But you think, like, you start out in Ur, why not just go straight? Right? And what we have to remember is this is a map, and it's not the real situation. What's between Ur and Canaan is impassable desert. I mean, just like...
No river.
No river. No river, no water, no nothing. And so what he does is he follows the trade routes that had been long established in there. In fact, it looks like for a while he's taking there's two trade routes in Israel. One's called the Way of the Sea, or the Via Maris, which kind of comes over and then goes down next to the Mediterranean Sea. And then on the other side of Israel is the Way of the Kings, and that's really what borders traditional Israel and that impassable desert. And so that will become a factor later on, all the way through Israelite history. Israel's just this little land bridge between two superpowers. It's always the Egyptians, and then up in north is it the Mesopotamians? Is it the Assyrians? Is it the Persians? It depends on which period of history you're studying. But basically, if you think about, like, they're sandwiched between the U.S. and the USSR, and they've got a little piece of land that is literally as big as New Jersey. Okay, and if those superpowers wanted to get at each other, they had to conquer Israel. So they could they could make a way, because they couldn't go through that impassable desert. So Israel, throughout its history, is constantly battling and having to negotiate with powers that are much more militarily sophisticated than their own, and that will definitely play a factor. But will also play a factor is when there's peace, relative peace in the region, and those trade routes are open, they're not being blocked by some army or something, you can tax the people along that route. And also all kinds of goods coming, from both ways come into your country. And so those times of peace were times of tremendous prosperity in Israel. But it really depended on those two trade routes being open. And when they're not, then it's kind of hellish. And we'll definitely find that. So Abraham already is just following something that, some paths. It's not just, he's just, kind of using God's, divine compass to go. He's following an actual trade route into the land. And there are certain archaeological finds that have taken place, especially over the last century, that seem to point to, they don't prove the history of, for instance, Abraham and Isaac and so forth, but they do at least point to some of the language. Like, for instance, there in Ebla in Syria, there was some tablets that were found that were dated between 2500 and 2250 BCE. And on those tablets, they had a lot of personal names and a lot of place names. And a lot of those, and there are certain personal names and place names that do correspond to what we read in the Bible. For instance, you get the name Abram, and in the Bible we have the personal name Eber. We have Michal, and Michal was the wife of King David. We have Esau. We have Ishmael. These are names that are attested in the Ebla tablets from hundreds of years before Abraham. We also have place names like Ur and Sodom and Gomorrah mentioned. And, when archaeologists are digging, that's always kind of a fascinating thing to see certain things that corresponds to the Israelite, history. There's not a lot. And part of the reason why there's not a lot is because in Israel they wrote on leather and leather rots. And so, there are some stone inscriptions, and there are some seals, like royal seals, that they have some writing on them, things like this. But by and large, our written evidence outside the Bible is Rose steering? Okay, good. Outside the evidence is fairly scant, and of course in Egypt they did write on hieroglyphics, so that's good. Those stay around in stone, but not a lot written about Israel there. But they wrote on papyrus, and papyrus also rots, of course. So the only place where we have a huge cache of written information is from Mesopotamia, because they wrote on clay tablets, these styluses, and then they baked the clay. And if you made a legal contract, you not only baked the clay, but then you put clay around it, and you baked that and put a seal on it so that it was sealed, and then you would just break open that outer seal if you needed to go back to the original document. And in Mesopotamia, it's almost like there's too much information. There's so much information cataloging everything from sales of goats to movements of kings to prayers to deities. There's so much information that it's hard to sort through it all. I remember when I was a graduate student at Princeton, we just had a minor cache of these cuneiform tablets, which we learned to translate. But that minor cache was like 3,000 little clay tablets, and that's just a tiny, tiny amount. And so it is kind of interesting, though we do have this kind of some of these names and place names attested in the extra biblical literature. But we have kind of this family tree that's established for Israel, and whether it happened that way or not, the story is describing what leads to the 12 tribes. And now the promise that was made to Abraham was that he would, even though he and his wife were older, that they would become a great nation. They would have a lot of descendants that outpaced the sands of the sea, and significantly, through their nation, the world would be blessed. So this is already the suggestion that will come stronger in Israelite history of they have been called apart as a people, not because they're better than anybody else, but simply because God apparently wanted, through God's own inner knowledge, to choose a people through whom to work in a special way. Now, whether you accept that or not is up to you, but that's definitely the story that is part of the whole Israelite ethos, and it starts with Abraham and Sarah and this covenant that God makes. Incidentally, the word for covenant is berith, which means cut. You cut a covenant in the Bible, and that's because in ancient times, if you were to make a covenant, an agreement, like a legal agreement between two people, oftentimes you would split, like especially if it was a big agreement, you would take a heifer and you would split it down the middle, and you would roast it. You have a celebration, and you'd have all of your people. They'd be eating, but also there's this quiet reminder that if you break the covenant, it's going to go for you kind of like this. And so you have an incentive, let's not break this covenant. So you are literally eating your acceptance of the fact that if you break this covenant, you might be broken yourself. That was the idea behind it. So Abraham, and there's Abraham and Sarah. Of course, we also know that they are told to have a kid. There's that famous story of the three messengers who come while Abraham is in the lounging under the oaks of Mamre, and they tell, and he provides this extravagant hospitality, and they say that they'll come back this time next year, and there will be a child. And Sarah laughs and says, "Are you kidding? She would have been like about 90, so rather impossible." And but so what they do, and this is going to start another theme that happens, not only the calling, but they try to take over and over. They try to take matters into their own hands. Like, okay, this isn't going to work. God surely doesn't know what God is talking about. And so Abraham's like, okay, well, and Sarah decide, well, how about you take Sarah offers her concubine Hagar, and he sleeps with Hagar, and they have a son named Ishmael, because she's a lot younger. And then God says, no, the covenant was actually meant to go through Sarah, so that causes some problems. But they continually are trying to take matters into their own hands because God's promises seem to be so outrageous and so unattainable. And then they make a mistake, and then God has to kind of clean up the mess. So for instance, besides the childbearing thing, there's a famine in the land, and they go down to Egypt to eat. But there was no, even though there's been, the narrative keeps saying God called Abraham to do this and this and this, there is no God called Abraham to go to Egypt. So apparently they're trying to take matters in their own hands again. And down there, Abraham is apparently just terrified that this 90-year-old woman is so sexy that the Pharaoh will want to will say, I want her, and we'll kill him in order to get her. So he says, well, hey, let's just have this narrative that you're my sister. And so they present themselves as brother and sister, and sure enough, Pharaoh finds her very attractive, takes her into his house, and then things start to go disastrously for the Pharaoh, and he finally, through his own discernment, realizes that there's something off here, and so it's a wonderful story about non-Israelites discerning accurately the will of God and saying, hey, wait a minute, and then gets all angry and gives Sarah back, and so forth. And then they go up into the land further, and then the same thing happens. He goes to another area inside Canaan, same thing. It's like, hey, they might think you're pretty sexy. Let's present ourselves as brother and sister, and the same thing happens with another leader named Ahimelech. It's possible that there's really kind of one story that kind of morphs, into two different stories as the tradition, because this is all oral history, right? And so there might just be one story that originated, but we have them doing the same thing and needing God to bail them out, and and showing that the non-Israelite is the kind of the moral one, and Abraham and Sarah were not so moral. And this is just kind of a theme then that we might be able to apply to us. We sense a call to connect with God in some special way, and then God calls us to do something. We try to take matters in our own hands. We mess things up, and then we need God to kind of come. And that's one of the things I appreciate a lot about the Hebrew Scriptures is that eventually they're writing things down that they think will be considered holy at some point, and they don't try to clean up the narrative. All the heroes in the Bible are also anti-heroes. They all make huge mistakes. And isn't that wonderful? Because now you realize, they're like us, and maybe we could, the difference isn't, that they are the moral ones and we're the immoral ones. It's like, no, we're all got our own problems. It's just the degree to which they are faithful. That's what separates them, ultimately faithful and following. And so maybe we could be a bit like that too. I'm not going to go through the whole history of, who begot who and so forth, but basically from Abraham and Sarah then comes the line that will eventually at the bottom become the 12 tribes of Israel. From Hagar's line is Ishmael, and that becomes the Arabs, and so we have now, even up to this day, right? The conflict already in the Bible times between, the descendants of Isaac, and the descendants of Ishmael, and we're still fighting. They're still like brothers fighting. But eventually, the kind of significantly, the one of those 12 brothers named Joseph. Excuse me. So he's considered special. Eventually, you get to Jacob, and Jacob then has 4 wives, as you can see. And his real love was Rachel, and through a very long account, he tries to get Rachel, then he's got to work 7 years and take Leah first. The father says, hey, Leah's not quite as attractive, so take her as a wife and work for me 7 years, and then you'll get Rachel. And anyways, a long story about he keeps having to work harder and harder to finally get Rachel, and then Leah bears sons, and so do these others. And then Rachel, his biggest love, then bears him 2 children, Joseph and Benjamin. And it's from Joseph you get that story about, we know there's the Joseph in the Technicolor raincoat. The Technicolor coat, the coat of many colors. The Hebrew there, it more like is a coat with long sleeves, but it was mistranslated earlier, and we remember this as a coat with many colors. It could be elaborately embroidered too. The Hebrew would allow that, but because Joseph, he's not only he and Benjamin are loved. Maybe a little more, there's a little more favoritism by his father. And then Joseph starts having these dreams that kind of, say, hey, I'm above you guys. and they get pretty mad, and they eventually, they throw him, the brothers secretly throw him into a pit, and he's sold off into some Midianite traders into Egypt, and then they go back to their father saying, oh my God, our younger brother was devoured by a lion, and they have this little piece of cloth that they've put some blood on, and so, for all practical purposes, Joseph is dead, but then he goes down to Egypt, and that's significant because it starts this next phase in Israelite saga of Israelites in Egypt, which obviously will become important. But rather than just become a slave, Joseph does well. He actually enters into Pharaoh's house. Pharaoh trusts him. He's seen as unusually intelligent and trustworthy, and there's that famous story of Pharaoh's wife also thought he was more than just intelligent and trustworthy, and tries to sleep with him, and he refuses, and then she accuses him of rape, and then he gets thrown into prison, and in prison he's still trying to do the right thing. Like you think, like somebody gets thrown to a pit, is sold off into Egypt, would just be completely depressed all the time. And what the story keeps showing is this Joseph, who everything bad happens to him. He keeps on being faithful, and the bad turns into something good. Yes, he was bad thing. He was sold into slavery into Egypt. Good thing, he got put into Pharaoh's household. Bad thing, he got accused of rape and thrown into prison. Good thing, he finds people there whose dreams he interprets, and eventually they remember this. One of them does, and when Pharaoh has a dream that he can't interpret, they say, "Hey, there's this guy. I can't remember. He was in prison with me," and they pull him out, and he interprets Pharaoh's dream that there will be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And so Pharaoh, according to the story, sets him over all of Egypt to then buy lots and lots of grain for 7 years and store it up for then 7 years of famine. And again, whether these stories happen this way, we don't have any extra biblical accounts that confirm the story. But again, whether it happened this way or not, it's those themes that are coming up, like that I think are so important for us, that, when life turns sour, don't just simply say, oh, it's all bad. You stay, you hang in there, you're putting your time in prison, you put in your time, what have you, and if you stay faithful, somehow life has a way of moving back around and helping you find your way again. And one of the big challenges that he's going to face is whether he can forgive his brothers for what they've done. And eventually, when the famine hits, then the brothers decide, we're about to die. Let's go down to Egypt. Over here, there's grain down there. And so they go, and little do they know, but the guy who's in charge of all the grain is Joseph. And Joseph recognizes them, but they do not recognize him. I mean, why would they? He's now in Egyptian regalia, and they thought, they wouldn't have expected to see him there like that. And so Joseph kind of wrestles with his anger and decides to he accused them of being spies, like there must be sent in the land to find out where the food is and so forth. And so he questions them, and when it comes out that they have one other brother, that they claim that there's one other brother that left Benjamin behind, because Benjamin is one of the two that Jacob loved especially. And since Joseph is now gone, Jacob was not going to allow Benjamin to go down in that risky trek to Egypt. So when he learns that Benjamin is not there, he says, well, you guys are obviously spies, but the way that you can prove that you're not is you bring Benjamin back, but I'll keep one of the brothers here as collateral, and so they're all this trauma, and finally they go, and apparently it's quite a long time. They kind of settle in. It's not until they're running out of food that they say, maybe we ought to go back down to Egypt and maybe and bring Benjamin with us. So they do, and then Jacob then sees them, and he, as they make their transaction, he puts a silver cup into Jacob's, specifically into Benjamin's sack secretly, and then as they're going off, he sends guards to look in the sacks, and lo and behold, they found this silver cup. They accuse him of of treachery. They bring him back, and finally now Jacob's kind of had enough of his kind of working out his own anger, and he then reveals who he is to the brothers, and they're all like, oh my God, and they are very, when he sees that they're truly repentant, like they really are grieving what they did to him, and they are very emotive about this, then he says, I don't hold this against you. What you meant as evil for me, God created good out of. There's the crystallization of that story. So then they go and send for Jacob himself, and he comes down, and Pharaoh is so happy with Jacob that he allots them some prime land in the land of Goshen. That's where that phrase comes from. That's on the Nile Delta, which was a particularly fertile area, but not widely inhabited. And so he allows Jacob's family to settle there. So avarice is kind of in that area of Goshen in the Nile Delta. And so that's where the Israelites are then for, according to the Bible, 400 years, then just kind of thriving in Egypt, and they multiply. And then it says, a Pharaoh arose that did not remember Joseph, and was kind of distressed by the fact that the Israelites are multiplying like crazy, and puts them under servitude, and they're still multiplying, and so he decides to kill the firstborn children. So he has this edict that all the midwives are to kill once they draw a male child out of the womb of a mother, they're to then immediately dispatch this child, and that's kind of hard for a midwife to do. And there's this one child, born named Moses. That wasn't his name. He was just his child at first, and the midwife couldn't bring herself to do that, so he hides him in a basket in the reeds, and the midwife does, and then the daughter of Pharaoh comes and finds this child and makes that child her own. That's how Moses then comes into the household of Pharaoh as a trusted person of Pharaoh. So you kind of see his history kind of repeating itself, like something bad happened to an Israelite, and yet God has a way of then, just like with Joseph, he was a slave, and then becomes a leader in the Egyptian kind of hierarchy. The same thing happens to Moses. And so again, there's just kind of this reminder: you hang with this particular God and remain faithful, and it will turn out better for you. Again, there's no extra biblical evidence to corroborate any of this. It's just simply part of the story. But we think that the Pharaoh who would have been in charge there when they were slaves and this oppression happens and Moses says, "Let my people go," was Ramses II. Comes from roughly the same time frame, and also it says that the Israelite slaves built 2 cities for this Pharaoh, because the Pharaoh isn't named, but said they built Pithos and Ramses, and Ramses was the one who built 2 cities. One was named Pithos and one was named Ramses. So there is corroboration of that story. At least that Pharaoh. So we think it was quite possible. There's other people who disagree, but majority of scholars think it would have happened under Ramses. Now, some people believe that this whole story, because there's so many potentially fictional elements in it, that nothing ever happened. So there are scholars, especially it's kind of in vogue to say, this is all just fiction. I think that's a little harder. I mean, I definitely don't. I think there's lots of non-historical pieces of the historical narrative here. But it's really hard, given the amount of emphasis that Israel puts, on this story and the little bits that are corroborated. It seems to me far-fetched to say that they just completely made this up out of whole cloth. There seems to have been a group in Egypt. There's a very rich oral tradition that seems to have been scattered throughout Israel, because then these stories emerge in different ways and they're repeated in different ways. So it seems to have been widespread. So I believe there was a group of slaves from Egypt that did have some sort of way of escaping originally. And of course, we know the story of Moses and the burning bush, and God calls him to confront Pharaoh. Moses is like, well, wait a minute, I don't speak so well, I stutter, and I'm not very eloquent, and there's this kind of dialogue, and God eventually gives him his brother Aaron to be the vocal piece, but tells Pharaoh to let my people go, and Moses asks, who are you that's calling me to do this? Which is interesting, what God are you? And that's where God says in Hebrew, I am Yahweh. But Yahweh in Hebrew means I am who I am. It can also be translated as I will be who I will be. And that's kind of interesting in and of itself. Like, I am who I am called you. Like, that's what he's supposed to tell people. Or I will be who I will be. And it's the first, that's one significant piece of data, I think, that's helpful to remember if you kind of translate this in spiritually. It's like, if you think the God that we serve really cares about us giving us any kind of certainty, forget it. All of the major characters in the Bible have to develop a healthy response to extreme uncertainty. And even through God's name, I mean, I will be who I will be, or I am who I am. I mean, you think this God cares about certainty, locking things down? Apparently not. And so, of course, we have this story of the Moses doing this, Pharaoh resisting, and finally the 9 plagues that come. And there's the whole Passover narrative. That's where we get the Passover narrative of finally the last after Pharaoh keeps on. You're seeing some pretty obvious signs that God wants to let the people go finally, and after not doing it, the final straw was to then have happen to the Egyptians what he did to the Israelites, which is to wipe out the firstborn sons. Not something you might picture a loving God doing, but again, it's part of the story. You just pay attention to what the story is trying to tell us, I think, which is essentially that when you oppress people over and over again, in order to then kind of bolster your own way of life, so that your way of life is easier, but on the backs of other people, that doesn't work eventually. I think the story is trying to tell us, even our own children who we think we're doing this all for, they end up dying, at least inwardly. Think about just how we have overlooked so much oppression in our own country. And, jobs are the most important thing, while other people then bear the brunt of that. And this story, I think, screams out to us, like, stop it, because you're not going to get away with that for forever, because eventually even your own children will turn against you in some way, or will be having their own problems. So don't just simply say, I'm doing this, I'm oppressing so that my child can have a better life than me. It's not likely to happen for very long, and that's what the story seemed to be saying. So then the Israelites are instructed to, before the Spirit then kills the firstborn children, are to put the blood of sacrifice a lamb, put the blood on the lintels and the doorposts of their house, and then the Spirit will see that's an Israelite and pass over them. That's where that name Passover comes from, and slaughter the Egyptians. And so and this will be a story that Jesus will later radically reinterpret. So, I mean, in the original, it's the innocent Jews being passed over so that God can kill the guilty Egyptians, and then Jesus later will replace himself with the Passover lamb, which I think is quite dramatic, a quite dramatic reinterpretation, because now if he's the one who's slaughtered, whose blood is shed, who's being passed over through, if it's the one who sheds the blood, it's his own crucifiers. So it's no longer the innocent and the being protected and the guilty being slaughtered. It's God saying, no, actually I love you all. So quit trying to sacrifice each other, keep trying to kill each other, because I actually love the oppressors like I love you. And so anyway, that's one of many ways that Jesus will take these old stories and reinterpret them in his own way. They go out into the Sinai Peninsula. There's a lot of confusion. The narratives are kind of there's some contradictions in the narratives about where they were and when and so forth, but the general idea is they're out there for 40 years. You see where Mount Sinai, we think, was located. There's also other possibilities. Sharm el-Sheikh is where we were going to fly from Cairo into Sharm el-Sheikh to avoid the dicey area, and then get up into to Mount Sinai from there. But this is a modern view of the traditional Mount Sinai. That's St. Catherine's monastery that is below there. And according to the story, God led them with a pillar of fire, and every time the fire stopped, they would set up camp. They would create a tabernacle, which is like a worship shrine tent, and they kind of assembled this from the stuff that they couldn't not leave in Egypt. So these escaped slaves, every little bit that they just couldn't leave behind, they took with us. And then Moses says, "Hey, let's throw down here. We need to create a tabernacle." And so they offer all this precious material. They create this beautiful tabernacle from it, and then it says the presence of God came and dwelt with them in the tabernacle. And then when the the pillar of fire would appear and then move, they would disassemble the tabernacle and move with the pillar of fire. I think it's kind of highly doubtful that actually happened historically, if possible, but I do think that's like rock solid, great truth that the story is trying to tell us, in the sense that the Spirit is always on the move, and we make our little sanctuaries. We think they're all nice and pretty, and they're beautiful, but eventually the Spirit's going to move on, and our job is to we can either stay where we're at and say, this is the way we've always done it, and this is what we know God met with us, and just stay where we are, or we can follow that Spirit. Maybe not physically, like move the church, but you move the ministry in ways that follow the Spirit's guidance. And I think that's part of the deep truth that the mythological imagination of the Scripture is trying to teach us. Let me pause at this point. Any questions? Yeah.
Is Mount Sinai the mountain that's scorched on the top?
There is another mountain. Well, and in Sinai Peninsula, there's like 3 mountains that have these scorch marks on the top, and they're not sure what. I'm not familiar. I'm sure scientists know what the scorches are, but I don't know much about them. There are alternate locations that have thought about Sinai, and there's one of the traditions says they went to Horeb, and that that may have been a different mountain, or that may have just been another name for Sinai. So it's all kind of murky, but this is the place that the tradition has decided that to kind of locate itself around is this one. Other questions? Okay. Moving on. So when did all this happen? Well, it happened sometime probably in the late 13th century, and by the time you get into the 12th and 11th centuries, Israel's definitely established in the land. We know this not just something from the Bible, but there's another case where we have this rare piece of extra-biblical corroboration. There's this stela called the Merneptah stela. Merneptah was a a successor to Ramses, a later successor, and he made many military campaigns into the Middle East, and one of them was into the land of Israel. And he set up a stela to congratulate himself for all his successes. And we found that stela, and were able to translate that stela. And this one little piece that's been highlighted in that little tiny box, it says, he says, Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. And that little tiny box is the symbol for the throw stick, symbolizes a foreign people. The two top phonetically sound out Israel, and the three sticks down below, I think, means many. There's many peoples, they're foreign, and they're a nation. They're an actual identifiable people known as Israel. So we know that by the time of Merneptah in 1207, 1208, Israel is already known to the Egyptians as a distinct people. He was a little wrong about them being laid waste, their seed shall be no more. But we do know that they were there by that time. The question is, how did they get there and how did they establish themselves? That becomes a little tricky. We know from the book of Joshua, if you take the book of Joshua literally, they came and they camped outside of Israel, and they came in and they conquered, Jericho in this dramatic, kind of almost like liturgical, go around 7 times with blowing trumpets, and then the walls came tumbling down. That is not only seems unbelievable, a little stretch of the imagination, but there's actually been archaeological digs in Jericho, and it turns out Kathleen Kenyon in the 50s excavated there, and what she was able to find was that, yes, Jericho was a demolished city. However, it was demolished probably at least 2 centuries before the Israelites ever got there. So apparently they got into the land and saw this, and then kind of developed this kind of narrative about that. And that's not just simply saying, hey, archaeology transcends the Bible. It's also the Bible itself contradicts the Joshua narrative in important ways. If you look at the book of Judges, it's clear that, if you can't put, the book of Judges also talk about Israel's emergence into the land, but it's told in a completely different way, where you have not just one charismatic leader that comes through and kind of wipes everybody out in one fell swoop, and that they kill all the Canaanites and take over the place. Judges is like there's several leaders over an extended period of time who really struggle against some of these people, and eventually they do establish themselves in the land, but there's a whole lot of Canaanites running around too. So the Bible itself contradicts itself in this matter, that making it really confusing. Then, but probably, more likely would be the gradual kind of. That's how life works, doesn't it? It's you have to count on a whole lot of supernatural activities to take Joshua seriously, and then you have to say, well, why does Judges say it's not? But how do you date this stuff anyway? That may be like, how does she know it would have been in the 14th century that Jericho was conquered rather than the 13th or the 11th or 12th? And that gets into there's lots of ways that archaeologists will date things, and today now archaeology is an extremely sophisticated discipline. It's really a host of disciplines. They have people whose entire job it is to study seeds, that are found at archaeological sites. There's people whose entire job is to study bones of animals that are left at archaeological sites. There's people whose entire job is to do kind of radar, kind of sonar kind of work to look at underneath the soil using electronics. But back in Kathleen Kenyon's day, she was using a very tried and true method where they noticed, like one of the ways was pottery, because pottery styles change over time. And so, if you start digging around Israel, you start comparing all the way around Israel, you see the stylistics, people's tastes change, or new technologies come into effect that people want to use the latest technology for pottery. So it's kind of like if I were to show you this, this set of toasters. Can you guess which one is the older ones and which ones are the young? Well, that's what they can do. If you're really familiar, if you're digging all the time and using the pottery all the time, this is exactly what happens if you study the pottery. Like, oh, that's that one on the upper left is obviously from an era that's quite different from the one on the lower right, and so that's one of the ways they date the pottery, and that they showed that it was really 14th century pottery. But what's also interesting and more confirming of the Judges narrative, but also adding some more nuance to this, is that there's in the last 100 years there's been increasing evidence that even though there may have been, and I believe there was, a group that came out of Egypt, there seems to be a whole lot of people who were always in Canaan. who ended up becoming part of Israel, and that the conquering of the land of Canaan seems to be an inside job. It's not just from a group that comes from the outside, but there were people already there who had reasons to want to create a different way of life than they were experiencing before. Now, one of the reasons we know that, or we believe that, is because the pottery, for instance, like you think it changed over time. Well, it really changes across people. Like, Egyptian pottery is extremely different from Canaanite pottery, which is very different from Mesopotamian pottery and Greek pottery. And yet, when you look at the pottery in Israel from the time they would have been coming in and afterwards, the pottery is the same kind of pottery that the Canaanites were already using. So there's no break in the material culture in terms of pottery. Also, the house structures also changed throughout the Middle East. And in Canaan, they had this 4-room structure that was very typical, made of stones, where the animals sleep, kind of in the middle in this courtyard thing. And this is what it looks like. And there again, you look at pre-Israelite houses, you look at post-Israelite houses, and they're the same. There is no change in the material culture in terms of their houses. And then you look at the material culture that indicates what religious beliefs were there, and you see a whole lot of overlap between native Canaanite beliefs and Israelite beliefs as well. Now later we know that, they're going to come with huge polemic against the gods of the land, and and Joshua will claim that they wiped out everybody and that they took down the altars and so forth, and there were no Canaanites to tempt them anymore. But we know Judges, a little different story. But we also know that if you look at the Canaanite pantheon, there's a lot of overlap between the Canaanite gods and Yahweh God, meaning, for instance, in the Canaanite pantheon, the high god was named El, and then underneath him was kind of this prince, the up-and-coming prince god named Baal. And one of the things that kind of gives us a clue that that maybe there was a lot more El and Baal worship than the Bible lets on is that they're constantly harping against these gods. Well, you don't harp against these gods unless there's reason to harp against them, and the reason you harp against them is because people are following these gods, right? And so there's this big struggle for what's going to be Orthodox Israelite religion and what's heterodox Orthodox religion. Just like as in Christianity, there's a big struggle between what's Orthodox and heterodox. This seems to have been going on in Israelite culture, but if you let go of the polemic and just look at what emerged, there's some really interesting suggestiveness about how we might relate to other faiths in our day and like claim Christianity is our path, but not deny the legitimacy of other paths that God may create for humanity, because that seems to have been what the Israelites actually were doing, even though later groups would try to deny that and enforce a very rigid orthodoxy. For instance, the word God in Hebrew, just the generic word God, guess what it is? El, yeah. Interchangeable. And there's another generic word for God. It was Elohim, which literally means gods. So whenever you see in the Hebrew scriptures the word God, not Lord, but God, that is El or Elohim. And El was the Canaanite God, the high God, right? And so that's interesting. And then Baal, there's all kinds of interesting ways that the term Baal comes into Israelite worship and even their everyday lives. Like, for instance, Saul names one of his sons Ishbaal. Well, Ishbaal means man of Baal. So there seems to have been some comfort, with some of these traditions. And sure enough, in the Bible itself, there are certain writings that, like Psalm 18, that seems to have been originally a psalm written to Baal, because Baal was the storm god, and it has this distinct imagery to Baal. And it looks like the Israelites just basically took this hymn to Baal and crossed out Baal and put Yahweh there, because it has the same Canaanite meter and thought forms and so forth, right there. And so there seems to be, the way I would look at this is that there was probably a distinct group of Yahwehs who came up out of Egypt. But when they encountered these other people who they would eventually come into league with, these native Canaanites, I'm going to talk a little bit more about why some of these native Canaanites would want to overthrow some of these people. they realized that there were some really helpful, some similarities between their beliefs and their, each other's beliefs. And so they started to work these into their own belief system. Just like if we have close conversations with Jews or Muslims or Hindus or so forth, we might say, you know what, I'm not going to be a Jew or a Hindu or a Muslim, but that's helping me understand my own Christianity. So you take some of these thought forms in, and so that seems to be what was naturally happening in ancient Israel. Now here's one of the key pieces of evidence that there was kind of this inside job. If you, it's not the. Oh, okay. Well, we can take those first. Yeah, this is really interesting. I don't want to blow your minds too much, but so obviously the Canaanite pantheon had a plethora of deities, and some of them were women, like Ashtart and Asherah and so forth. And on some of the few Israelite inscriptions we do find from like the 9th and 8th century, we have these curious Israelite inscriptions naming Yahweh as their God, but also apparently for many of them there was a Mrs. Yahweh named Asherah. So like one of the tablets that I actually myself had to translate as an exercise in grad school was this one from Khirbet el-Kom, which is a funerary inscription. This was found outside of somebody's crypt, and and the text is kind of broken up, but it says essentially, Uriahu the wealthy man had it written, "Blessed be Uriahu by Yahweh and by his Asherah. From his enemies he saved him." Written by Oniyahu, and then there's kind of broken up, and it again says it's by his Asherah, and broken up, and again it says by his Asherah. So Mrs. Yahweh. That's far from the only one. We see the Kuntel Ajrud inscription, for instance, "I have blessed you by Yahweh of Samaria and by his Asherah." "I bless you, Yahweh of Teman, and by his Asherah." Sorry. And it's kind of broken up, and give Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah. Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah favored. And so you have these inscriptional evidence of this, but you also have, curiously enough, in the city of Arad, which is in the south of Israel, this kind of way station where a lot of trade was kind of passed through, you have this ancient Israelite sanctuary that's dated to about the 9th or 8th century. And what you're seeing there is the Holy of Holies. So that's like the holiest place in the Israelite sanctuary, where only the priests went. And what's curious about this is in a normal Israelite sanctuary, you would expect to see one altar that's meant to offer incense. And that's like the one see that one on the left, that square thing. Incense would have been offered as a sacrifice to God there, likely frankincense. But you see the smaller one, like there's normally just one. Why would you be burning incense on two different ones, and one smaller than the other? And behind them are tablets that are also associated with recognition of the dwelling. And there again, there's two tablets, not one, behind there. One's a little bit smaller than the other. Well, aren't females in general a little smaller than males? And so there seems to be a suggestion that at least at this sanctuary, Yahweh and Mrs. Yahweh were honored. Now, curiously, and this really blew my mind, very recently, they've done some analysis of the material that were in the burned there, and in Arad, anyway, I'm not aware of other places, but in Arad, they found traces of cannabis. Just saying. Kind of interesting. Anyway, so there seems to be kind of this more expansive kind of view of the divine and some of these characteristics of Canaanite culture that will later be weeded out. But in the early times, there was still this struggle going on, like and after the struggle's over, there will be there's only one God for sure, at least one. There's only one God they are going to follow, but certain aspects of the Canaanite culture's belief system got integrated into their conception of the one God. Now, the proof, kind of more proof that this was an inside job, not just an outside job in terms of emergence in the land, is in the last century there was a dig up in Amarna which is up in the in the north, and they had. Let's see, where is it? That's not on this map. Anyway, they dug up a whole lot of these tablets, and thank God they were Mesopotamian tablets. They were all written in cuneiform. And these were letters that were written throughout, between different leaders in the ancient world. And, no, wait, Marna's in Egypt. Anyway, their correspondence between some sort of Egyptian overlords and the lords of these different sectors, and some of them were quite normal, just talking about trade and so forth. But regularly, we find them complaining about this group of people who are basically ruffians that they find up in the hill country, and they are kind of outcasts, and they are considered dangerous. They're considered thieves and looters and so forth, and they call these people Hapiru. Apiru. Does that sound like any name you? Apiru? Apiru, Hebrew. Like, that's awfully close to the word Hebrew. And so there are a lot of scholars, and here's a couple of examples. From Reb Hadah, mayor of Byblos, or Gebal, Sumer, your garrison city have joined the Habiru, and have done nothing. Send a large force of archers. Yeah. From Milikili, mayor of Gezer, king, the war against me, and Shuvwardata, mayor of Hebron, is severe. Save your land from the power of the Habiru. Yeah. Kind of interesting. And this happens up in the hill country. And the reason why these kind of ruffians probably are up in the hill country as opposed to the fertile valleys, which are a lot easier to live in, is because they were probably originally from these fertile valleys, because nobody settles the hill. The hill country is dry. It's really hard to make your life work there. It's really hard to farm, and so the original settlements all were around the fertile valleys of Israel. So likely as people came from there, but you can imagine the city life does not work for everybody. I mean, there's taxation, there's certain laws that are meant to keep some people oppressed and other people not. And there seems to have been this movement of people from the cities, at least a certain percentage of them, up into the hill country because they're tax evading or their life is just not working for them. They're driven up into the hills. And the one advantage of living in the hill country in Israel is that you can't get a chariot up there. And so they can't be pursued. And so they kind of develop this kind of alternate society in a sense. And then right around the time when Israel is known to have come into the land and have been established there, there's a new technology that's developed that started in either the very, very late Bronze Age or certainly by the beginning of the Iron Age, which is right around 1000 or 1100 BCE, but or 1200 BCE rather. And that is what was invented was, not that. I don't know where the slides went. Well, anyway, pretend you're looking at terraces, like shaped terraces on hillsides. That's what was developed, was terrace farming. And so you know how terrace farming is all about conservation of water, limited resources of water. So right, the water flows downhill, it's caught before it goes on. But terraces they involve a lot of labor to create, a lot of labor. So you need to have some sort of social system built up because you're not going to build a terrace on your own, nor is your family going to build a terrace. You need the help of others. And so there has to be some sort of more elaborate social structure built up. And further, once you build a terrace, you don't want to lose it. You don't want to have some invader come in and say, hey, we kind of like, now we can live up in the hill country. We want these. And so you also need some sort of military protection. So it seems to have happened, and there are scholars who will disagree with what I'm saying. But if you take the majority view, you kind of get this picture of people who are already up in the hill country. They've kind of been driven up there through some of these oppressive forces in the fertile valleys, where we have these very wealthy kings and kind of this very rigid society. They're up there. They're kind of living one step away from the law. Some of them are kind of outcasts and got these military leaders writing, hey, these Habiru, they're driving us crazy, right? And then you get this group from Egypt coming up who has this Yahwistic belief. They start to mix, and they start to mingle, and they start to learn from each other, and they start to form some sort of more cohesive society together. They're building terraces. They've got the social system built up, and then once they've got all this huge investment up there, they're more attractive to the other peoples. And so in the book of Judges, you get all kinds of stories about people from the outside coming in trying to take over. And so you get these charismatic leaders that Israel will follow for a period of time in order to meet a threat against these other outside forces. And so over time, that's what ends up leading. They have enough kind of pressure from the outside, from other peoples, from the valleys, and also just other peoples that are surrounding Israel, wanting to take their land, because they got these nice terraces now, that they've got to form a much tighter leadership system. They can't just rely on temporary judges rising up anymore. They need to have somebody who can call out to all of the tribes, say, we need you to show up in this battle, because they kept having a problem that, like if you look at the book of Judges in chapter 5, Deborah was a woman judge who rose up and protected the people. But there's this great song of Deborah talking about this great military victory against the outside peoples, but then laments the fact that a few of the tribes stayed home. You just can't have a few tribes stay home if you got these people. So that's what eventually will lead to the establishment of a more developed kingship and in Israel. But that's kind of the early emergence in the land. They seem to have been kind of outcast. They were very suspicious of overlords, because think about the people who came from Egypt. They had been oppressed by overlords. And the people who were up in the hill country already, they had been oppressed by overlords. And so there's this idea that only Yahweh is our king. We only follow Yahweh. So early on, you just got these judges that rise up in times of threat to then lead the people. But as soon as the threat is over, the judges go away until the next threat. And eventually, that just doesn't work anymore. They just got to have a king and an army and be able to conscript people. And that's what leads to Saul and eventually to David. Whew, that was a lot of history in one session. Any questions, or are you completely confused now? Yes?
You said, Ale, God, and whatever it is we were talking about, does that mean every time you drink a beer,
What was the last part?
every time you drink a beer, you drink him a God?
Yale, yeah. Curiously, when I was at Princeton, I met one of the great missionary families, the Moffat family, who was very famous for missionary work, especially in South Korea. And I had dinner with Samuel Moffat one night before he died. He was talking about these early days. And he said, the Bible's kind of interesting the way that worked with the ale and the God and stuff, because he said that when we would go into a village, we would normally try to first listen to the people and learn their belief system. And usually there is some sort of high God that's kind of like the grandfather, the nice, gentle grandfather God. And there's some other God that's kind of like does the action, kind of like Ale and Baal. Ale was kind of this grandfather type that people didn't really worship him directly anymore. They're really about Baal, but Ale was clearly seen to be the grandfather of all gods, the real power. And so we would normally, you take that God and we say, the God we believe in, the God of Jesus, the God Yahweh, is like that one. Your high God. And they would start to draw points of connections, like how their God, our God, really did reflect aspects of their high God. And so it became easier then for the people to convert. Now, whether that's a technique that's good or not, I don't know. But anyway, it's just kind of interesting that you see this pattern also in modern society worked out back then, is that they found a way of coming together when they look at the highest point of their religion. Kind of like when we try to do interfaith dialogue, we normally come together when we're not talking about like in the weeds. We're talking about what's the highest ideal of your religion. That's where we seem to, like compassion, what we just learned this morning. 21 world religions saying compassion is one of the highest things in religion. That's where we can all kind of gather around. Well, they're doing the same thing back then, way back thousands of years ago. And that's what kind of helped create and become the kind of the fermentation vat that became later Yahwistic religion.
Eric,
Yes?
do I remember the scripture correctly that when they went from judges to kings, God warned them
Oh, yes.
to do that?
Definitely. Yeah, there's all kinds of hemming and hawing about that, and there's this great story about, that one of the prophets, kind of offers like God, or rather there's this call for be a king, and so they approached the blackberry bush, said, would you be our king? And the bush says, hey, I'm way too busy producing some good stuff for people. I don't have time to be king. And they approached then the apple tree. I can't remember. Anyway, I'm way too busy producing this, wonderful fruit for the people. And then they approached the bramble bush. And the bramble bush says, I'll be your king. Sure. You all come under me. That reflects this inherent suspicion of the government. But in the end, even Yahweh says, it's not because this is the best thing, but I recognize the people are not going to be content until they have a king. And so in the scriptures, there's kind of like this Yahweh concedes. Like, it's not ideal, but we live in a practical world. Have a king if you want. But just know, then there's this warning, like, this king is going to conscript your children into military service, not just your neighbors. So be careful. This king's going to tax you like crazy, and all these warnings. So yeah, you can have a king, but just beware, And so yeah, was it 1 Samuel chapter 8? Yeah. All right. Well, that's a lot of history in one session. You can solidify this if you read Genesis starting in chapter 12, as far as you want, and next week we will look at the emergence of kingship and then go from there. Okay? All right.
If anybody would like to sign this poster to go into Tiago's room, I'll be out there with the pumpkins and this Be the Match sign that we're going to his hospital room.